During the week after the Canadian Grand Prix, the International Olympic Committee met in Budapest to award the 2002 Winter Olympic Games. 10 cities had originally entered bids, though the Kazakh city of Alma-Ata, known nowadays as Almaty, withdrew early in proceedings. From the remaining 9, a 4-city shortlist had been made: Östersund in Sweden, Quebec City in Canada, Salt Lake City in the US, and Sion in Switzerland. And Salt Lake City was chosen as the host by a decisive vote in the first round. Salt Lake had been unsuccessful 3 times before, and in 1998 allegations would surface that their bid had been giving gifts to other organising committees, nothing actually illegal, but it caused enough of a scandal to cause the 2 heads of the Salt Lake Organising Committee to resign, launch 4 separate inquiries, and lead to the expulsion of 10 IOC members. The Space Shuttle Atlantis docked with the Russian space station Mir for the first time, delivering relief crew Anatoly Solovyev and Nikolai Budarin, and retrieving American Norman Thagard, who had in early June broken NASA's time in space record of 14 days, 1 hour and 16 minutes. The US may have won the race to put a man on the moon, but through the 70s and 80s the USSR had taken the lead in space station programs, with 7 Salyut stations of varying degrees of success, while NASA's Skylab, aloft from 1973 to 1979, had suffered all kinds of problems, though it was ultimately judged a success. Now, with the end of the Cold War, the Russian expertise in space stations and the American reusable vehicle allowed for a greater degree of international cooperation, and plans were already afoot for a permanent international presence in orbit. And the Rugby World Cup wrapped up in South Africa. The hosts had made the final in a close semi against France, while England were taken apart by New Zealand in Cape Town, not least thanks to the 4 tries of Jonah Lomu, who at 20 was one of New Zealand's rising stars, playing in his first major tournament. The final then took place in Johannesburg between the hosts and the favourites in a feverish atmosphere. Rugby had traditionally been the rich white sport in South Africa, with soccer the poor black sport, and indeed there was only one non-white player, Chester Williams, in the Springbok side, but things were changing in South Africa, and the stands were full of faces of various hues waving the new rainbow flag. A new anthem for the country was in the works, and in the meantime the old Afrikaner one, De Stem van Zuid-Afrika, was sung alongside the Xhosa hymn, Nkosi Sikelel Afrika. Play was cagey, with no tries scored in the first half, and the second half ending tied at 9-9, with Joel Stransky having scored all of South Africa's points and Andrew Mertens having scored all of New Zealand's. And so for the first time the final went to extra time. New Zealand got a penalty kick and made it 12-9, Mertens again, then Stransky returned the favour with a penalty the other way. With 7 minutes left on the clock, Joel Stransky hit a drop goal from 30 metres out, finishing the game 15-12 and sending the stadium into orbit. In what was regarded as a hugely symbolic moment for the new South Africa, Nelson Mandela, in a Springboks shirt and South Africa cricket cap, handed the trophy to captain Francois Pienaar. Jean Alesi could maybe guess a little at the emotions of the South African players in the 3 weeks following his win in Canada, but he couldn't relax too much. He had a full programme of sponsor engagements, and of course everyone wanted some of his time now, and there were still 12 races of his season to go, so there was development work on the car and an intensive testing programme at Monza. But one person who Jean was having difficulty talking to was Luca di Montezemolo. Gerhard Berger had mentioned in passing that he'd had an offer on the table for 1996, which worried Jean, and Montezemolo seemed to be avoiding him. When Alesi finally got a word with him at the opening of a Ferrari dealership in Rome, Luca congratulated him on his victory in Canada, but changed the subject when 1996 came up. What Alesi probably suspected, but couldn't know for certain, was that Niki Lauda was deep in discussions with Willy Weber about bringing Michael Schumacher to Maranello. Weber upped the price to 20 million. No problem for Ferrari, said Niki. There was lots left to sort out, but if it did happen, the question was whether either Berger or Alesi would partner Schumacher. Berger openly disliked the young German, while Alesi was on better terms with him, but neither were particularly in the mood to play second fiddle. There was a new government in Paris, meanwhile, and new President Jacques Chirac was keen to be seen to wield a new broom and sweep away the waste of 15 years of Mitterrand's socialist government. In the firing line of the new austerity plan was the 75 million franc tobacco fund set up by outgoing Prime Minister Edouard Balladur to compensate for the loss of revenue to French motorsport following the Evin law that banned tobacco advertising. Jean-Marie Balestre, nowadays president of the French Motorsport Federation, went Jean-Marie ballistic, calling it intolerable behaviour that the French state wouldn't honour its commitments and promising that the federation's legal department would take on the case of any team or individual who felt they needed it. Even with the fund, there'd been a sharp drop-off in opportunities for French drivers in F1. There were 7 French drivers at Magny-Cours in 1994, but just 4 in 1995, Alesi, Panis, Bouillon and Gachot, who was only technically French anyway. He regarded himself as a European citizen, held French, Belgian and Luxembourg passports, and began his career racing under a Belgian licence. There were plenty of young drivers making their way up through the junior formulae and looking for opportunities. Emmanuel Collard, Eric Ellery, Laurent Aiello and Christophe Bouchou, for example, who had been named as a Larousse driver before Gerard finally gave up the unequal struggle, plus the likes of Erics Bernard and Comas, Jean-Marc Gounod, Paul Belmondo and even Olivier Gouillard, who were all hoping to get back into an F1 seat soon. So the alarm sounded by Jean-Marie Balestre was not entirely without merit, and after some governmental dithering, Jacques Toubon, the Justice Minister, was dispatched to attend the French Grand Prix and talk to the various French interests, and, not coincidentally, bypass Balestre in the process. But there were positives for French motorsport in this centenary year of the Automobile Club de France, the first automobile club in the world and founder member of FISA. Thanks to a fortunate happenstance, Ligier would be celebrating their 300th race at their home track, where they traditionally did well. Team manager Bruno Michel had arranged an exhibition of every model of Ligier to have raced since their 1976 debut, an amalgamation of the factory's own collection and the private collections of Jacques Lafitte and his friend Pierre Landereau, and of course Guy Ligier himself, and as many former drivers as they could manage were in attendance too. And financially straitened times notwithstanding, Jean-Paul Driot announced that his Formula 3000 team Dams were planning to enter Formula 1 in 1996. The GD01 chassis, co-developed with Reynard, was nearing completion, and it would be powered by the Ford ED engine with Eric Comas at the wheel and possibly Olivier Panis. Elf had already put their name on the car. There was still some way to go to get the finances together to enter F1, but things were looking promising. Jean Alesi's win in Canada had seen a surge of ticket sales, so despite clouds on the horizon, the Magny-Cours organisers and the fans in the stands were in buoyant mood, and of course even if Alesi didn't win again, the chances are that it would be a Renault engine, or possibly a Peugeot, that took the honours, and there was always a chance that the Ligier team would do well. Renault had put on a demonstration with Schumacher in Berlin, doing donuts in front of the Brandenburg Gate as they tried to capitalise on Germany's new hero to sell more cars there, and for the race they had supplied Benetton and Williams alike with the new B-spec version of their RS7 engine, re-engineered to give a broader power band, and not to be outdone, Jordan were also sporting the new Peugeot A10 EV2, which the Sochaux firm promised would give more grunt and, yes, a broader power band. Benetton accommodated the new engine within a new engine cover that dispensed with the step partway down and had a dynamic air intake, and of course the design was then lent to Ligier, which didn't do a lot to counter accusations that the JS41 was just a resprayed B195. Over at Williams, Adrian Newey had made some modifications to the FW17, including copying Sauber's rear body fairings, as well as a revised rear wing, new diffuser, and redistribution of ballast. At McLaren, Neil Oatley and his team had switched to Penske dampers and redesigned the chassis for more rigidity, sufficiently to require a new crash test, while they also had a new diffuser and some more tweaks to their engine. But Ferrari, who had promised a whole package of upgrades here, had actually decided to shelve them, other than having a new, slightly more powerful V12 in the back, evidently deciding that if the car won, it was good enough. The 40 car had received some major modification too, a raised nose, new side pods and plenty of less obvious ones, the overall effect of which was that the car was starting to look like an F1 car rather than an up-engined F3000 one. Only one of the new chassis was available and given to Diniz for this race, though both had the high nose, with the second one promised for Moreno at Silverstone. The team's abysmal pace so far this season had led the FIA to float the idea that a new rule could be introduced for 1996 that cars had to qualify within 107% of the pole time, which would restore some jeopardy to qualifying, but also ensure that cars slow enough to constitute an actual hazard, like the 40s, wouldn't be clogging up the track on race day. 20 good cars are better than 26 bad ones, said Max Mosley, while Bernie Ecclestone indicated he'd be willing to go as low as a 16-car grid. Minardi had also done some modifications, but on Thursday evening, a bailiff from the Nevers local court arrived and placed seals on their equipment due to Giancarlo Minardi's unpaid Cosworth engine bills, estimated at £435,000. In typically opaque F1 fashion, the engines were leased from an Irish company, Grand Prix engineering sponsorship, one of whose shareholders was Tom Walkinshaw, who was now of course being sued by Minardi, with his Ligier hat on, over the theft, as Giancarlo put it, of the Mugen Honda engine deal, and was therefore less inclined to do the small team any favours. Much legal toing and froing ensued before Dominique Dumas, Alain Prost's lawyer, pleaded their case in the Nevers court, and Minardi's assets were unseized, but not before they'd missed Friday qualifying. It was hot on Friday, and the Williamses were dominant, Hill and Coulthard topping the timings, while Schumacher was complaining of a lack of grip, though he was still within 3/10 of Damon, while the Ligiers was 6th and 7th, an encouraging sign for French fans in the stands. The weather held despite cloudier skies on Saturday, and Schumacher had checked down the back of the sofa and found that grip he was missing, and a thrilling three-way battle for pole between him and the Williams drivers ensued, which was won by Hill, taking pole at Magny-Cours for the third time in a row, every time he'd tried it in a Williams. Schumacher, just over a quarter of a second behind, was beside him on the front row, with Coulthard 0.7 seconds exactly behind in third, but a whopping 8/10 ahead of Alesi in fourth, who had a hydraulic pump failure and generally suffered a lack of balance. Barrichello was fifth, just for once easily out-qualifying Eddie Irvine, who couldn't get his car handling right and was back down in 11th. Alongside Rubens was Olivier Panis, who was delighted to out-qualify Brundle for his home race and give Ligier a good chance of scoring points. Berger, 7th, went off on Friday and damaged his tub so badly he had to qualify in the spare, with Hakkinen 8th, with the car still unbalanced and suffering problems with his gearbox electronics. Blundell was down in 13th after failing to cope as well as his teammate. Brundle was 9th, having gone off early on Saturday and qualified in Olivier's car, and in 10th was a disappointed Johnny Herbert, who was becoming increasingly disillusioned with team and car. The Saubers were dropping back, now 12th and 15th, with Bouillon improving to within 7/10 of Frentzen, while the Tyrrells were suffering from a lack of power and grip, and the new suspension didn't seem to be making much difference. And at the back, as usual, were the Footworks and Minardis, both suffering a simple lack of grunt, and in the former case some severe understeer, with the new 40 an improvement, but only enough to narrow the gap to the Pacifics just ahead. Just as in Canada, the rain arrived on Sunday morning, though it had stopped by the time of the warm-up, and Alesi was top of the timing charts on a damp track, ahead of Coulthard and Barrichello, but just as in Canada, by the time of the race the track had pretty much dried out. So everyone would be starting on slicks, though there were some worrying dark clouds still lurking on the horizon. From the green light, Hill got a great start, while Schumacher got a little bit of wheel spin and, defending his line, cut across in front of Coulthard, which let Barrichello nip up into third, while Panis had also got a great start to go up to fifth. Meanwhile, Inoue and Katayama collided at the exit of Estoril, eliminating all of the Japanese drivers in the race. Hakkinen got a bit out of shape further round the lap and bounced across the gravel at the Nürburgring corner, which lost him several places and wouldn't do his tyres any good, and then a bit further round and off-screen, Montemini nudged Martini onto the grass, and then, in the process of regaining the track, Pierluigi hit Pedro Diniz and nerfed him off. But up the front it was still Hill, with Schumacher right behind, both tearing away from Barrichello, Coulthard and Panis, who were having an almighty three-way scrap over third, with Herbert now up to 6th, and the Ferraris queued up behind him. Montemini came to have his suspension looked at, and the crew decided it was early enough in the race to make it worthwhile just replacing the whole thing, and 5 minutes later he was underway, resigned to an afternoon accruing data rather than racing. On lap 3, a fired-up Alesi went down the inside of Herbert at the Adelaide hairpin, but touched the Benetton's right rear and nudged Johnny into a spin, ending up right across the track. As the Ferraris went round the outside, Brundle stuck to the inside and passed all three, taking sixth, while Herbert found his gearbox didn't want to select anything, and his race was, once again, all over almost before it had started, thanks to someone else's overambitious overtaking manoeuvre on the inside at a hairpin. Schumacher set the fastest lap that time around and was all over the back of Hill like a sweaty t-shirt, so at the end of that lap the top 10 were Hill, Schumacher, Barrichello, Coulthard, Panis, Brundle, Alesi, Berger, Hakkinen and Irvine. Brundle was flying in pursuit of his teammate, setting the fastest lap himself on lap 5, but all the attention was on the two leaders, as well it might be as they were really going at it. It was certainly great to watch, with Hill and Schumacher trading fastest laps now, lapping the delayed Montemini on lap 8. It transpired that Barrichello and Panis had both made starts that were a bit too good, and on lap 9 they were both signalled in for 10-second penalties, which would please Coulthard sandwiched between them, but by that time DC was already 8.5 seconds behind Schumacher and had a bit of catching up to do. The miscreants came in together on lap 11 and returned to the track 9th and 10th, Rubens regaining the track just behind his teammate. Meanwhile, the leaders were now coming up on Roberto Moreno, which gave Schumacher an opportunity he couldn't quite make the most of, followed by having a little look at the Ligier as well. No dice there either, but there was certainly no let-up in the scrap at the front. Further back, Coulthard was catching Hill, but Brundle was catching him quicker, and the window for the first pit stops was approaching. Indeed, the Ligier team were running a 3-stop strategy, and Panis was the first in on lap 18, and then next time around it was Schumacher, a great stop from the Benetton crew with Brundle in at the same time. Hill in the lead, meanwhile, was getting held up behind a trio of backmarkers, Martini, Morbidelli and Sarlo in 17th, 16th and 15th respectively, as Schumacher charged on his fresh tyres. Coulthard was next in from second, a 12-second stop putting him out behind Brundle, nearly colliding with Alesi as he got going again, with Hakkinen also in. It was fast and furious in the pits. Hill was in next time around lap 21, having lost a lot of time behind Morbidelli on his in-lap, and when he regained the track he was second, some 8 seconds behind Schumacher, who put up a new fastest lap as Barrichello came in for his own stop. Berger dropped by for his, but the Ferrari mechanics just could not get the fuel hose seated properly, and Gerhardt was stationary for 54 seconds before he got moving again, now in 17th. Martini had come in for fuel, only for his gearbox to throw in the towel as soon as he left the pit lane, while the Ferrari mechanics were still trying to work out what was wrong with the fuel rig before it was time for stop 2. So when the dust had settled on the first round of pit stops, the big winners were Schumacher, who'd taken a decisive lead over Hill, Brundle, who'd nabbed third off Coulthard, who was right behind him and keen to get it back, and Barrichello, who'd passed both Irvine and Hakkinen to go into 6th and back into the points, just 6 seconds behind 5th place Alesi. Schumacher wasn't just leading, but he was pulling away from Hill at a second a lap, while the French director picked up a good battle over 8th place between Hakkinen and Panis, passing Bertrand Gachot, another victim of a dud gearbox, while Hill had lapped Morbidelli again and was now after Montemini. So as the halfway point of the race came and went, with Martin Brundle no doubt relishing lapping Gerhard Berger after being nerfed off by him last time out in Canada, Schumacher was romping away, extending the gap back to Hill to 13 seconds. But before Martin could get past the Ferrari, he peeled in for his second stop, returning him to the track 5th, with the other Ferrari of Jean Alesi 3 seconds ahead and next on his target list. Meanwhile, the other Ligier was still behind Hakkinen and was definitely being held up, but would also need to make a stop soon. The clouds were also gathering above the track, and pit crews were casting suspicious glances at the sky. On lap 43, a few spots of rain were appearing on the in-car cameras, and coats started going on in the stands, so it was a bit of a surprise when Hill made an early stop at that exact moment, departing after 11.7 seconds on a set of slicks, now 43 seconds behind Schumacher. The leader came past the battling Hakkinen and Panis as the light drizzle stubbornly refused to develop into any actual rain. Panis stopped on lap 45, and then it was Coulthard's turn. He didn't lose a place to Alesi because the Ferrari came in too, and then it was Schumacher, a stop nearly 3 seconds faster than Coulthard's on the same strategy. David's car won't have been hugely aided by nearly colliding with an incoming Barrichello as he left his box, and the Jordan mechanics were having a busy time because Irvine was in next, only to stall and need restarting, losing 20 seconds and 5th place, rejoining behind the ongoing Hakkinen-Panis battle, which was thus now over 7th place. In fact, that was about the only battle left on track, as Hill, 14.8 seconds behind Schumacher with all the stops done, seemed to have given up on the idea of winning and was just driving for the 6 points. There was disappointment for Bouillon, who came in from 13th only for his transmission to pack up on his way out of the pits, and frustration for Panis, who just could not find a way past Häkkönen's McLaren, while the other McLaren of Mark Blundell had been having a very average race, running in 11th, and now had Gerhard Berger bearing down on him as he tried to recover from that disastrous first stop. That pair had already made their second stops, both coming in together on lap 48. Schumacher was setting fastest laps for fun now, still extending the lead over Hill, while Berger had caught Blundell and on lap 54 nearly repeated his move on Brundle in Canada, locking everything up and throwing it down the inside, but Blundell held his nerve and the line, and Berger managed to stop just in time, so a collision was avoided, for now. Heaving into view behind Berger was Alesi, about to lap his teammate, which he did at the Adelaide hairpin next time round, which was unfortunate because Blundell hadn't caught the move and thought the red car behind him was still Berger. Blundell's old mate Brundle pitted from third, a quick stop but not enough to keep him ahead of Coulthard, but enough to get him out not too far behind either, so Martin could still aim at a podium finish. Back to Blundell, who was merrily defending his line as he thought it from Alesi, who was not happy about it, and neither was Jean Todt. With 15 laps to go then, it was all over bar the shouting at the front, as long as Schumacher's car kept going, but Brundle still had his foot to the floor in pursuit of third-place Coulthard, who was about 5 seconds ahead, but finding his Williams a bit erratic and had eased up a bit. So Brundle was closing at a rate of knots. When the Scot was held up a bit by a back marker, Brundle was on him as they made their way through more traffic, and with 17 cars still on track there was certainly plenty of it. Once they were both through, Coulthard had managed to put his foot down a bit and extend the gap to just over 2 seconds. The two Brits weren't the only ones having trouble in traffic, as Alesi got impatient behind Morbidelli and Bedour and flung himself through at Adelaide, giving the trademark fist shake to Luca, only to nearly lose the back of the Ferrari in the process. Back to Coulthard, who was trying to lap Moreno for the 6th time, and while he was successful, it held him up enough that Brundle was able to close back up once again, but again Coulthard could just put his foot down a bit and ease away again. So Schumacher cruised home to take his 4th win of the year, a demoralising 31 seconds ahead of Hill, who was almost exactly the same distance ahead of his teammate in 3rd. Brundle came in 4th, crossing the line 4 tenths behind Coulthard, Alesi 5th, and the last point was taken by Rubens Barrichello. Not a bad day for French motorsport in the end, with French engines in the first 3 places and the 6th, a French car in 4th, and a French driver 5th, and if not for Panis's early penalty, the home team could have easily had both cars in the points. Häkkönen in the end stayed ahead of Panis, with Irvine and Frentzen making up the top 10, Blundell stayed ahead of Berger, and 17 cars were still running at the end, though Montemini was 10 laps adrift and unclassified. Hopefully the Pacific team had got some useful data out of it at least. A despondent Williams team were left to deal with the fact that this time it wasn't strategy, Benetton were just faster, on the track and in the pits, over a whole race. The two cars were close over a single lap, but the Benetton just seemed to have better fuel efficiency and Schumacher greater consistency. There were 2 weeks left before the British Grand Prix, home race of both Williams drivers and one of Benetton's, as well as most of the teams, depending on whether the season would end up being 16 or 17 races, and it was increasingly looking likely that it would go the full 17, with 2 of the races that had been doubtful, San Marino and Spain, already done and dusted, and work now proceeding at Monza. The season would reach its halfway point after Silverstone, and Schumacher and Benetton were looking good in both championships. Even a win for Hill in front of his home crowd, with Schumacher not scoring, wouldn't put Damon back on top.